Hello and welcome to the FCC Next Steps podcast. My name is Jordan. I'm the lead pastor at First Christian Church in Monmouth, Illinois. And this podcast is just a way for the staff at FCC to present to you some discipleship content that may not necessarily fit well on a Sunday morning or in a classroom context, and give you something you can digest at your own time, on your own schedule. I know some of you listen to this in the morning, some of you listen to it in the evening, your lunch break or something. And so thank you for tuning in so consistently. And we pray that this is beneficial to you and to your faith. Today, we're going to continue a series through Genesis 2 and 3 called People and Purpose. That's really, at least as I look at these stories, what I really zero in on them. And they are stories that really talk about people. And our experience in life and why things are the way that they are. Two prominent images or aspects of this story are the Garden of Eden, where the story is set, and then the trees, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life in the middle of the garden. And so we are going to be looking at that today, those two things, starting with the garden. So let's take a look at the passage that really talks about the garden. And we'll learn a few things about that. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, it says, "Now the Lord God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." So we'll pause there for just a second. So there's some geographic clues given to us in this passage and then later in verse 14, which we'll read in a minute, that help us not kind of locate the area in mind where Eden may have been, but more specifically, it helps us, it reminds us who the story is written to. So Eden was a region known to the original audience. It just says a garden in Eden. And it doesn't give any explanation as to where that is. And so we assume the original audience that was hearing this story had some idea where Eden was. But more importantly, it says that it was planted east in Eden. And you might ask then, okay, east relative to what? What is east? What are we talking about here? By giving a direction, the story assumes a specific audience that's located someplace geographically. And seeing as this is Israelite literature in the Torah, we're probably talking about Canaan. More specifically, in verse 14, there's a mention of 4 rivers. 2 of them, we know where they're located, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Those are east of Canaan. And so it gives us a pretty good idea, maybe of the area that we're talking about, but more specifically, this is a reminder that we're talking about a story written to a specific audience, a specific group of people, and it's not written universally to all people. It's not written to you and I in the 21st century living in the United States or wherever you're located. It's written to ancient Israelites living in the land of Canaan. Now, there's a picture on the screen if you're able to look. There's 2 circles. The leftmost yellow circle, that's roughly Israel or Canaan, where the Israelites would have been located. And then the rightmost circle is the Tigris and Euphrates, are those 2 main rivers there. That's likely the region that's in view here, east by the Tigris and Euphrates. And the reason I say likely is because there are some other geographic indicators in the next section that make it a little less clear what we're talking about. But we are generally talking east of Canaan, somewhere in this region, what we call the Fertile Crescent, most likely. Asterisks, little star footnote and stuff, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the important part here is just to remember, this is not a story written directly to you and I. And because of that, we have to resist coming at this story with our particular cultural expectations and assumptions, which is something we often have been guilty of in coming to this story in the past. We expect oftentimes to read a story about material origins that answers scientific questions according to modern standards, And that's just not what this story is. It's not writing to a culture interested in any of that, really. It's writing to a culture that's interested in very different questions and had a very different perspective on what makes something real, what makes something um, alive, what makes something exist. It's not so much a matter of material origins and atoms and so on, as so much as divinely ordained purpose and function. Does it have a place in the universe? It's just a different way of looking at the world, and we have to remind ourselves of that as we read this story and resist the temptations to import our own expectations. I keep saying that every episode, but that's because it's one of the strongest temptations that we often face, is trying to read the text on its own terms instead of ours. With that said, let's go to the next section because there's more about the garden itself that gives us some indicators about what it is and so on. So verse 10 says, "A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there, it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. And the name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. And the name of the third river is the Tigris, and it runs along the east side of Asher. And the fourth river is the Euphrates." So we have a description of the garden here, and there is some geographic data here, but that's not the most important part, really. What we read is that it's watered by 4 rivers. We already mentioned the Tigris and the Euphrates, but there's also the Pishon and the Gihon. We have no idea where the Pishon and the Gihon rivers are. Tigris and Euphrates, we got that. We still have those. No idea where these other 2 rivers are. Some have speculated that they could be located in Africa, and these could be 2 tributaries of the Nile. Some have speculated these could just be tributaries running off of the Tigris and Euphrates. We have no idea where these rivers are located. Complicating that, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's mention of Havilah, Cush, and Asher. You would think, because like Asher, we have a decent idea where that was, but like you would think with specific regions mentioned, we'd have a better idea, except it doesn't really make sense. Havilah is mentioned, I forget where exactly, but I think it's Ezekiel later in the Old Testament, but it's really synonymous with a region of like northern Africa. Cush is sometimes synonymous with like is it Ethiopia? Again, Africa, which is nowhere near the Tigris Euphrates, mind you. So some people speculated that like maybe there is an African Havilah and a Mesopotamian Havilah, because there's no reason that we have to assume the Havilah mentioned in the Old Testament is what Genesis is talking about. All this to say, there's a lot of uncertainty about the specific geographic region that's in mind here. All we can say for sure is that it is east of Canaan and somewhere along the Tigris and Euphrates. That's what we got. That's not really significant to the purpose of the story, though. I mean, it probably was more significant to the original audience because they had an idea where this was. But what's really important or stands out for our purposes is understanding that it's watered by 4 rivers. There's an abundance of water here, fresh water, that apparently produces a lot of trees and abundance. So this is a picture of a well-watered place, which you need to remember, like they didn't have reservoirs or like indoor plumbing or anything. So having a steady supply of drinkable, usable water was super important. And this has 4 rivers. It also mentions that there's gold in this place. And not just gold, but this is good gold. The gold there's good. And that sort of recalls Genesis chapter 1, where God says that things are good. They're usable. They're functional. They have purpose. They're ordered. This gold is good. Also located in this region are aromatic resin and onyx. And this isn't just mentioned because it just wants to tell us about some of the minerals available there. We have to remember that this is in the context of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. these books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they all flow into one another, even literarily. One sometimes it's geographic, sometimes it's events, where one story ends, or that one book ends, the next book picks up recalling the conclusion of the previous book. These are meant to be understood in light of one another. And so if we're reading the story about Eden, we have to remember it fits in the context of this larger body of work. And resin, aromatic resin, and onyx, and gold for that matter, were important when understanding the tabernacle or temple structures later on in the Old Testament. Like in Exodus chapter 25, verse 1 through 9. There's a list of materials that God tells the Israelites to use in the construction of the tabernacle. Among them are gold, onyx, and then it's not called aromatic resin, but I forget the phrase is used, incense, which would have been related to aromatic resin. This is all to be used in the construction of the tabernacle, which was the tent of meeting where God's presence would dwell among his people. Later on in the construction of the temple, onyx and gold specifically are used in the construction of that temple. Again, the place where God's presence dwells among his people. In Exodus chapter 28, verse 9 through 14, God instructs the Israelites, in I believe it's the construction of the priestly ephod, there to use 2 onyx stones, and the 12 tribes of Israel, their names are to be engraved, 6 on each stone there. And so there's a priestly significance, a temple significance attached there. All that to say that there are little hints, little breadcrumbs here in the garden description that would likely have evoked temple imagery or temple ideas and associations in the minds of the original reader. And that's not an accident. As we keep going in this particular session, we're going to see that that's really what's being described here in the garden, is sort of a sacred space, temple kind of location. For instance, we look at the garden and we have to wonder, okay, it's east of Canaan, located in Eden, and it is depicted as this sacred space that God himself creates. The question that is it a centralized sacred space? And what I mean by that is, so there's this tendency in cultures to imagine themselves as the center of the world. We do this to some extent, even subconsciously. If you ever, if you look at a picture of the Earth from space, if it's created by an American artist or an American company, chances are North America is going to be featured in the middle of that picture. Not China, not Australia, North America, because we tend to view ourselves as the center of the world. Several sessions ago in our Genesis 1 study, we looked at an ancient Babylonian map of the world. Remember flat world. I wish I could put it on the slide. I'd show you, but it's a slab with like a flat world, a circle, and there's little mountains on the side of it. And dead center is Babylon. They are the center of the world because that's how they understood themselves. So the question then is Eden, the Garden of Eden, is this the center of creation? And I think you can make a strong case that it is, and we'll get there in a minute. But before we do, we have this temple imagery. This sort of just runs throughout the Eden account. It's this lush garden with all these trees that are beneficial, and it's guarded by cherubim at the end of Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve are kicked out. And we see these kinds of pictures and this iconography in various different temple descriptions throughout Scripture. In 1 Kings chapter 6, for instance, when Solomon is constructing the temple, you read through that and you read that on the walls of the sanctuary are flowers, open flowers and gourds and palm trees. And in the Holy of Holies, there's these 2 golden cherubim who are sort of guarding the entrance, and I believe guarding the entrance into the Holy of Holies where God's presence dwells. All of that is reminiscent of Eden. Ezekiel chapter 40 through 47, Ezekiel describes this vision he has of this heavenly temple. And there's a river that runs from this temple, and there are palm trees. Yeah, and let's see, are there cherubim in that one? I don't think there are cherubim in that one, but definitely pictures of palm trees on the inside of the temple, around the sanctuary walls. And there are abundant creatures and fish that live along the river that flows out of the temple, similar to all the animals in the garden. There's a lot of garden imagery there. Revelation 21, this vision of the heavenly Jerusalem. And it says there is no temple because God himself dwells with them. The whole city's a temple. God's at the middle of it. And what runs out of this city but this long river featuring this new tree of life from which 12 crops of fruit blossom. And it's garden imagery. When we look at the Garden of Eden, we see a sacred space. And it's not sacred just because God planted it. It's sacred because God inhabits, to some extent, this garden. He meets with man in the garden. We got to Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. At the end of the creation story, we read about God entering his divine rest. And we clarified when we discussed that this isn't God taking a nap or putting his feet up because he's tired. Whenever a temple was constructed and a God's presence inhabited that structure, he would enter a divine rest in it. And we read that at the end of the temple construction in 1 Kings as well. God's presence, the cloud of his presence, falls upon the temple, and he rests within it. Creation itself is being depicted as a sacred space. God dwells within it. The question then is the Garden of Eden then sort of the Holy of Holies? Is it the central place in this sacred space? And I think there's a strong indication to believe that it is sort of being depicted that way. We don't read of God's direct presence really being anywhere else except in the garden. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, we read that God was walking in the garden in the cool of the afternoon. He didn't live in the garden. He still lives in heaven, but the garden was the place where he directly interacted with humanity, with the man and the woman. That's where you found his direct presence. And that's sort of reminiscent of a Holy of Holies kind of structure. And so we have here the whole of creation being a temple, with the garden being sort of the Holy of Holies. And even adding to this idea, or solidifying this idea, is that we read in the middle of the garden were the two trees. So these two trees are at the center of all of creation. And that makes sense when you understand that one of them is the tree of life. The other is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You could make a case, and John Walton has made the case, that we could interpret that as a tree of wisdom. Wisdom and life being the two primary things that the gods possessed or were in charge of that humanity lacked. And so we have here this divine cosmic tree image, which was pretty common in ancient Near Eastern literature as well. So before we move on, summarize this. The Garden of Eden is not a vegetable garden. It is this lavish, beautiful park full of riches and opulence. It is a vibrant place of life where even the presence of God at times will dwell. And the whole thing functions as, at the very least, a sacred space, but likely the very center of all space. The center of creation is the Garden of Eden. And that's the place where God and man meet and interact face to face. It's a beautiful picture. So that brings us to the issue of the trees and the fruit. Like we said, the trees are at the middle of the garden, and trees and fruit, they're very general images. I mean, tree imagery is used in pretty much every culture. So when we get to the ancient Near East, it's not an exception, and we find lots of usage of tree imagery. And there's not a lot of direct comparison between garden as it shows up in Genesis and gardens as they're used in other cultures. Other ancient Eastern cultures, they did have like God's garden or the divine garden, but it's slightly different. Like people weren't invited into that place. They're almost seen as intruders. Yeah, and it's just different enough that we can't say, yeah, this is a direct, kind of speaking into one another. Trees are different though, especially in fruit, because trees and fruit are used in a particular way in some of these ancient Near Eastern stories where we can point to that and say, okay, there's a conversation happening here between Genesis and the rest of the world. For instance, Adapa and the South Winds. This is an ancient Near Eastern story. Highlights of it. The main character is named Anu, and Anu is a priest of Ea, the god. And so Anu, I'm sorry, Adapa, I got turned around. Adapa is the priest of Ea, and Adapa is the main character. So Adapa is offered the fruit of immortality by a different god named Anu. And yet, despite being his priest, Ea deceives Adapa and lies to him. He says, Anu is not telling you the truth. Do not accept that fruit. And so Adapa refuses Anu's gift. And in doing so, he misses out on his chance at immortality. And the story, Adapa kind of functions as an archetype. Because Adapa missed out on immortality, we all have missed out on immortality. And so that's one, you can probably see the parallels there. There are some differences though. As a priest, Adapa would have been understood as possessing wisdom, but he lacks immortality. That's what he's trying to get. Adam is as we said in our previous session, sort of a priest-king figure. He has access to immortality because he can eat freely from the tree of life that God's permitted him to, but he lacks wisdom. Or at least he lacks wisdom apart from God. And that's his great sin, is trying to gain that wisdom, the knowledge of good and evil, apart from God. And so they're different. They're not the same story. It's not like a carbon copy, but there's a conversation happening here about the nature of life and wisdom and man's place, his relationship to the divine. Whereas in Adapa and the South Wind, the gods are not friendly to people, and they don't really, at least Ea, doesn't really want his priest to live forever. In the Genesis story, God does want people to live forever, but he wants them to be dependent and in union with him, because as we said in our last session, that's how we were made. We were created mortal, needy creatures. We find our needs met and our life met only in the Lord, not apart from him. There's another important story, the cosmic tree in Eridu. Now, this story's a little older. It's Neo-Assyrian. And so what we're talking about here would be about like the 7th to 9th century BCE. So like 900 to 700 BC. When we're talking about the ancient Near East, we're really talking about like the Israelites were probably like 1500 or 2000 BC. With Neo-Assyrian, we're talking about 9 to 700. So this is a much later story, but it's important for later parts of the Old Testament, and it illustrates the imagery and the motif of the tree and how it was sort of ubiquitous in this culture. In the cosmic tree of Eridu, this tree is it's this huge tree, and it could probably be compared to Yggdrasil of Norse mythology, sort of the world tree. So, but this cosmic tree in Eridu, it is this tree that stretches with its roots reaching down to the underworld and stretching all the way up to heaven. So this massive tree, and springing from the tree are nourishing waters. I misspelled that, I apologize, but nourishing waters. And this tree is associated with, or at least it's located outside of this temple to Shamash, the sun god. And it's believed to be at like the place where Shamash enters and exits the underworld when he dies every day. When the sun goes down, Shamash dies and he goes into the underworld, and then he's resurrected the next morning when the sun comes up. So that's the picture of this tree. And what's interesting is that a very similar kind of image shows up in Ezekiel chapter 31, when Ezekiel is giving his prophecy against Egypt. and he talks about, or he references this, or actually it's the Lord through Ezekiel references this great tree that stretches up to the heavens that all the creatures find their rest under, and whose branches stretch out over the nations, and then God chops it down and it falls and it goes into the underworld. It may very well be a reference to this story, and not acknowledging that there was, or affirming that there's some great cosmic tree, but rather referencing this story or this image in the imaginations of the Egyptians and saying, hey, that great tree, my God toppled it and he's coming for you next. Daniel 4, another similarity. This is Nebuchadnezzar receives this vision, or has this dream rather, and calls upon Daniel to interpret it. And the dream is this great and mighty tree that is, it kind of fits this description, but then is cut down and its bark and limbs are all stripped away. And Daniel interprets that and he says, hey man, you're going to go crazy and you're going to go live in the woods. This great arrogant king toppled. Again, not affirming that this tree existed, but tapping into that imagery and that cultural shared vocabulary, I guess you could say. And so it's the Old Testament referencing the vocabulary of sorts that ran throughout all of these cultures. So tree imagery, super ubiquitous. The Gilgamesh epic, this one, some kind of immediate parallels. So Gilgamesh is the main character. He acquires the plant of life, or sometimes it's translated the plant of heartbeat. And he gets it from these cosmic waters, that is where the goddess Ea, I think, some goddess dwells there. But he goes down to these cosmic waters and he acquires the plant of life. And if he eats this, he will live. It's his chance at immortality. But unfortunately, he's not paying attention, and the plant is stolen away by a serpent of all things before he can ingest it. And that's why Gilgamesh can't live forever. And by extension, why people can't live forever, because a serpent stole it away. You can probably see some parallels there. And we'll talk more about serpents later on in another episode, because they're really interesting images. Finally, if you're able to look at the screen and watch here, we have a couple of reliefs. These are, again, Neo-Assyrian reliefs, and I got it backwards there. Or no, I put it 9th to 7th century because it goes backwards. So these are from that later time period. But what we have here are two reliefs, and there's a few others that just weren't as clear, but they were still really good too, of a tree of life image. You see it where my mouse is here, and you can see it in the center here. This was a really common image. Usually the fruit from the tree of life was like a pomegranate, and they're usually divine beings. You can see some Djinn here, these being Assyrians, so these Djinn were spirit beings, and they're usually fertilizing the tree of life. This guy's using a pine cone, and I don't recall the significance of that. But from this tree of life, people would have access. For a while, it was believed to life, but there really isn't anything in ancient Near Eastern literature, as we have access to it right now, that explains what the tree of life was. It shows up a lot. Art historians, the most recent theory is that rather than being really a tree of life, it really was a tree of wisdom, that it represented order and function in the created world. And that would make sense. If it's the tree of life as we think of it, that makes sense why it would show up in Genesis the way that it does. But it also makes sense if it shows up in Genesis or if this rather in ancient Eastern thought was a tree of knowledge or a tree of wisdom, because then it shows up again in Genesis, but again functions just to make the point that we don't attain wisdom for ourselves. We have it in relation to God and our dependence upon him. So either way, it makes sense why it would show up in Genesis, and that imagery being so common in this culture. I just think it's interesting that we have this iconography that is just runs through these different cultures and serves similar purposes, but sometimes argues with itself too. I don't know if that's entirely clear. It's still kind of formulating itself in my mind a little bit. All that to say, trees and divine fruit, very common images and motifs in these ancient cultures. So what kind of conclusions can we draw from this? Divine gardens, trees of life, fruit of life or fruit of the heartbeat, they were all very common motifs in the ancient Near East. This was sort of the storytelling vocabulary that people in this part of the world at this time use. So it shouldn't surprise us at all that the Old Testament, not just Genesis, but the whole Old Testament, makes use of these same images. We talked about a few of them. Ezekiel, Daniel, the Psalms makes heavy use of a lot of these images. We see some of it in the New Testament. We saw in Revelation, for instance. And so this iconography and these motifs, very common. And the Old Testament uses all of these. Sometimes it uses them in similar ways to the rest of the culture and the world around them. Sometimes it uses them in rather unique ways to convey a different message. All of it is inspired truth. And I want to emphasize that last part. We've been approaching this as literature. It comes to us in the form of a story. Historicity is sort of a secondary matter as far as this particular study goes. Whether there probably was literally Eden because it has so many specific geographic markers. There was a region that people knew as Eden. Whether or not there was a literal garden with literal trees and literal fruit and a literal serpent, maybe there were, but that's secondary. That's not really what the story's focused on. Rather, this is a story trying to convey theological insights, truths, and understanding to people as they would have best understood it. And the way that kind of information was best conveyed to people, the one that they were most familiar with and could most easily and readily access and process, was this storytelling with all of these shared images and motifs and iconography and vocabulary at times. And so if it seems like there's a lot of similarity and that concerns you a little bit, like, well, did Genesis just borrow all this stuff? I thought that it was special. It is special, but not because it's unique, but in the unique way it uses that very common information and that very common vocabulary. For instance, if you look at Genesis 2 versus the rest of the ancient Near East, we see some very important distinctions that clarify God's truth. Divine gardens or sacred space, they have very different roles and very different rules surrounding them in Genesis compared to the rest of the ancient Near world. In Genesis, the garden benefits not God, it benefits man. There's gold and resin and there's onyx. God doesn't need that stuff, but they're beneficial for people. There's trees of all kinds that produce all kinds of delicious fruit that the man is freely able to eat from. That's not beneficial to God. That's beneficial to man. There are two trees in the middle of the garden, and only one of them is forbidden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life, however, there's no prohibition surrounding that. Man is able to freely eat from the tree of life and live forever within the presence of God. That's not for God's benefit, that's for people's benefit. So this sacred space, as far as Genesis is concerned, is all for the benefit of people. In other ancient Near Eastern accounts, the Garden of the Gods is for the gods. That's where their food is grown. It's for their benefit. In fact, people are almost seen as intruders in that space, whereas in Genesis, humanity is put there. They're invited to come into this space and to work it and to keep it and fulfill their purpose and to walk with God in the cool of the afternoon. This is a very different kind of God and a very different kind of creation. Sacred trees, they also are very different in Genesis than they are in the rest of the ancient Near East. Life, as we said, is available only in connection to God. If you want to freely eat from the tree of life, then you have to rely upon God. That's how we were made and created. Now, there's no prohibition surrounding it. God doesn't try to keep the tree of life from people so long as they're connected to him. He doesn't put a fence around it, whereas we saw in the Gilgamesh epic, Ea did not want her priest to have eternal life. People are meant to die and to stay away and be differentiated from the gods. Wisdom, conversely, is available only through God, whereas in the ancient Near East, people could attain wisdom for themselves. But so long as we stay attached to God, he provides us with his wisdom and his ways. So life and wisdom are not things that God desires to keep from people. Whereas in the ancient Near East, they were very much things they sought to keep from mortals. The gods kept eternal life and wisdom unto themselves because those were sources of great power and benefit. And so we see a very different kind of world with a very different message about a very different kind of God, despite the fact that it uses very similar kinds of imagery and storytelling. I hope that as you listen to this, you may want to listen back through this episode. I hope some things are firing in your brain and you're starting to see over the last few episodes something about the nature of God and his relationship to people. This is a God who invites us and created us to draw near to him. This is something that has always been the case. We're only truly alive in connection to him. And when we turn our back on him, when we turn away from him, that's when we lose everything. In our pursuits to gain everything, we lose everything. Instead, this is a God that beckons people to come and find fulfillment in him, to be near him in his sacred space, that he can draw near to them and that they can work side by side to do good things. This is a very loving, caring, inviting kind of God. So I don't know if you have misconceptions about who God is and you see him only as the God of wrath of Noah's day, which even then it's not really wrath. It's justified, because we'll get to that story some other time. But maybe you have some misconceptions about who God is. I hope this picture of God and his world and of yourself is maybe being clarified a bit through this study. That's my hope, and that's all we have time for today. I hope that you'll be able to join us for the next session when we continue reading through the story. We're going to be talking about women, the origin of women as they show up in the story, along with the nature of marriage and its significance, and maybe some insights we can draw from that part of the story. So that's coming up next session. Until then, I hope that you are blessed and have a great day. Bye.